Okay, we will start. So, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. So first, I would like to thank the International Association of Tourism Economics, and more particularly, Veronica Leoni and Oriol Anger for the organization of the IATE webinar series. Thanks again to our two speakers, Aimée Torres and Massimo Moltoni. So today we have two presentations, about approximately 20 minutes presentation for each one, and then following by a 10 minutes question and answer. So participants can ask for a question directly after the presentation by using either the microphone or by using the chat box from the Teams applications. Please note also that the webinar will be recorded. So many thanks again to all the speakers and participants. And now please let me introduce our first speaker. So Aimée Torres is a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Applied Economic Analysis at the University of Alicante. She holds a PhD in Applied Economics. Her research focuses on regional economic convergence and income inequality, with a particular emphasis on the role of tourism specialization and knowledge-intensive sectors in shaping regional economic development. So Aimée, I give you the floor for your presentation entitled A Research Agenda on Tourism and Regional Economic Convergence in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. I will present my screen now. Okay, is it working? Perfect, so I will start. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, and thank you very much for being here. I would also like to thank Veronica and Oriol for organizing the seminar sessions and for inviting me to participate today. And of course, also to Professor Nicholas for moderating the session. My name is Aimée Torres, and after defending my doctoral thesis a few months ago, I am currently working as a researcher at the Department of Applied Economic Analysis at the University of Alicante. And well, my presentation today, as the title suggests, is about a research agenda focused on the relationship between tourism and regional economic convergence in Europe. And more specifically, the presentation brings together several interconnected working papers that I'm working in that explore whether tourism contributes to reducing regional disparities or whether its effects depend more on different structural, temporal, and territorial conditions that we should be taken into account. So the presentation is therefore organized as a progressive research agenda, and each stage emerged from the limitations or findings of the previous one. And okay, the central question guiding this agenda is simple, but also highly complex. It is, to what extent does tourism really promote regional convergence? And we know that tourism is often presented as a driver of growth, employment, and regional development. However, whether tourism actually contributes to reducing regional inequalities or not remains far from being clear. And this ambiguity motivated the broader research agenda that I will present today. So before starting, I would like to briefly introduce the research team behind this agenda, which is composed of Professor Luis Moreno Izquierdo and Professor Julián López Milla from the University of Alicante, also Professor Salvatore Bimonte from the University of Siena, Professor David Matesan from the University of Oviedo, and myself, also from the University of Alicante. So about the theoretical foundation of this agenda, we need to know that they are rooted in the classical growth framework, particularly in social model. And as maybe you already know, within this framework, economies are expected to convert due to diminishing returns to capital, and then the poorer economies are expected to grow faster through a catching up process. However, the literature saw that convergence is neither automatic or homogeneous. So as a result, we can difference between different forms of convergence, as, for example, the absolute convergence, which assumes that all economies converge toward the same steady state. Conditional convergence, which instead assumes that there are different steady states, which depend on structural characteristics and the initial conditions of each economy. And finally, we also have the convergent class theory, which argues that convergence occur only within that groups of regions that share similar characteristics and not necessarily global convergence. So this idea of heterogeneous convergence trajectories becomes especially important in the context of tourism economies, and let's see why. We know that tourism-led growth hypothesis propose that tourism can act as a driver of economic growth, and indeed a large share of empirical evidence has normally found positive effects of tourism. However, the relationship between tourism and the regional convergence remains, as I told before, much more ambiguous. Specifically, this evidence is high mix and strongly context dependent, and the results vary depending on factors, for example, such as initial income levels, also proactive structure, tourism intensity, or, for example, the period that we are analyzing. So some studies identify positive convergence effects, while others are identifying weak convergence or even divergence. And that suggests that tourism should not necessarily be understood as an automatic convergence mechanism. And another important debate concerns the fact that the relationship between tourism, innovation, and structural transformation. So this is mainly because tourism is normally associated with lower productivity levels, lower technological intensity, and also limited innovation. But at the same time, the growth theory emphasizes this role of the innovation and knowledge accumulation as drivers of the long-run development. So this raises an important question related with if too high tourism specialization could limit the productive diversification and the structural upgrading. So taking this into account, if innovation becomes really concentrated in already advanced regions, this could weaken the catching up process and then reinforce the existing disparities. So I move to the empirical part of the presentation. Regarding the data employed, I would like to only to say that the analyses are mainly based on Eurostat regional database, going from 2003 to 2023, and combining. Sorry, I'm hearing a. Okay, now. Thank you. And combining both NUT2 and NUT3 regional levels. The main variables include GDP per capita in PPS, together with several indicators of sectoral specialization. And particularly attention is given to tourism specialization and high technology activities. Although, in addition, other sectors such as manufacturing, construction, agriculture, or professional services are also considered as control variables. So the first empirical stage addresses the following question. Does tourism specialization promote regional economic convergence in Europe? And to answer this question, we estimate conditional beta convergence models using regional panel data. And we compare the results for tourism specialization with high technology activities and other productive sectors. So about the method, this first stage relied mainly on fixed effect panel models and also cross-sectional data. And we also explore whether tourism effects may be nonlinear. So we introduce nonlinear specification in our model. Tourism specialization is measured through the employment shares in accommodation and food service activities as a proxy. And the models also include control variables linked to productive structure and sectoral composition. So, or not only to evaluate whether tourism affects growth or not, but also if it affects vary depending on the degree of specialization. So moving to the results, the first major result is that tourism does not display a simple linear relationship with convergence. And specifically, we find that moderate levels of tourism specialization may support regional growth, but once tourism dependence becomes too high, the positive effects weaken and may even reverse. So it suggests that the existence of diminishing returns associated with excited tourism specialization. And by contrast, we see that the technology intensive sectors tend to display more stable and positive relationship with the convergent dynamics. So overall, these effects also are the same in the case of cross-sectional results and also panel fixed effect results. And this suggests that tourism cannot be understood as a universal convergence driver. On the contrary, its effects appear to depend on structural conditions, as I told you before, and on the productive configuration of its territory. Well, this first stage therefore leads to two major implications. The first one is that regional convergence cannot be explained through a single sectoral mechanism. And the second one is that productive diversifications appear to play a key role in sustaining long trajectories of convergent processes. So these results motivated us to continue with the next stage of the core agenda. In this stage, we start to consider the following possibility. And it's, okay, if tourism does not generate homogeneous effects across Europe, perhaps European regions do not converge toward a single equilibrium. Then, instead of assuming a common convergent path for all the regions, the analysis this time explored the existence of convergent clubs. And to address this question, what we do is to apply the methodology of Philip and Sul Convergent Club. Okay, this approach allows us to detect different regions, different group of regions that converge within themselves, depending on their growth trajectories. It's important to know that this methodology does not impose convergent at first, so it allows for multiple steady states and different transition paths. So the results mainly show that European regional convergence is highly heterogeneous, and rather than converging toward a single equilibrium, we can say that the European regions form multiple convergent clubs. Specifically, some regions display relative high and stable income trajectories, while others remain like trapped in lower income regions. We can see also that the spatial distribution of the clubs also reveals geographical patterns. For example, the northern and the central European regions tend to concentrate in higher income clubs, whereas peripheral regions, we can say, are more frequently associated with lower income trajectories. These findings also reinforce the idea that convergent processes in Europe are fragmented and differentiated. So the second stage suggests, in this case, that convergence should be understood as an heterogeneous and path-dependent processes, and not that all regions are following the same development trajectory. So from here, it also raises a new question, which is, okay, if convergent clubs exist, they are stable over time, or some macroeconomic shocks can alter them, can alter the convergence dynamics, no? So the third stage focuses on that temporal dimension. It's important to highlight that one limitation of the standard Phillips Sul frame that I explained is that This method assumes stable convergence dynamics over time, but major shocks, such, for example, the global financial crisis or the COVID pandemics, can alter the regional trajectories. So in this stage, we incorporate these structural breaks into our convergent analysis. And what we do is by using Bayes and Perron structural break tests, we are able to detect shifts in our series. And once these breaks are detected, we again apply the Phillips and Sewell convergent club methodology, in this case within each subperiod, to see if convergent clubs remain stable over time or they are changing and reorganizing as a result of these measures. So our analysis identifies a main major structural break around 2010. As you can see, before that break, European regions display a stronger convergent dynamics. But after this break in 2010, we see that convergence became slower. So our finding also that our findings also show that the number and composition of convergent clubs also changed. So we can say that the major macroeconomic shocks are reorganizing the regional convergent regimes. And these results also suggest that convergence is not temporally stable and it depends on broader economic conditions. And in the final empirical stage, we introduce another perspective, in this case, an spatial one. We thought that if convergent dynamics change over time, perhaps they also depend on the territorial scale that we use in the analysis. And checking the literature, we saw that most of convergence analysis only focuses on a single territorial level, commonly is NUT2. But this aggregated scale, some authors say that may conceal important intra-regional differences. So to explore this issue, what we do is to develop a case study focused in this case in Spain, where we compare the results with using NUT2 and NUT3 levels. Well, again, structural breaks are identified using Bayes-Perron test. And with Phillips-Schultz, again, we estimate the convergent clubs for NUT2 and NUT3 regions in that case. And finally, we compare economic convergent clubs with tourism specialization clubs to see if they are related. So the main findings, the main results show that the spatial scale matters at NUT2 level. In the case of economic class, we can see that convergence appears more stable and aggregated, but when we use NUT3 in our analysis, it reveals much more fragmented and heterogeneous dynamics. But we have to admit that no robust relationship was founded between tourism clubs and economic clubs. So for now, we can say that maybe tourism appears to depend more on territory-specific characteristics rather than acting as a universal convergent mechanism. So taking everything into account, these different stages for now point toward 4 major dimensions shaping regional convergence. The first one, that convergence dynamics are not linear. The second one, that they are structurally heterogeneous. Third, that they are temporally unstable. And the final one, that they are highly dependent on the spatial scale that we use in our analysis. So overall, tourism should be understood as a context-dependent component of regional development, but not as as a universal convergent driver. No. So about policy implication for now, just to highlight that there isn't a single development strategy that fills all regions in Europe. And secondly, also to highlight, to point out the need of productive diversification to to reach a sustainable regional convergence, and also the importance of operate the policies should operate at more disaggregated spatial level, not only need to scale. And if not, we can maybe be like omitting local disparities, locally important disparities. So finally, I will also want to highlight that tourism policies should be integrated with innovative ecosystems, combining this tourism sector with knowledge-intensive sectors in order to reach that long-term upgrade. To finish with that, like any research agenda, this work also presents limitations, for example, the use of sectoral proxies, and of course, the use of more or less short-term periods. And about the future research agenda, we have a lot of research directions now open for us, but maybe my favorite one is the possibility to study if tourism specialization can change the probability of regions to belong to different convergent clubs, and we are planning to do it using logit models. And finally, just for you to know, these are some of the working papers related with this research agenda. Now they are in revision, but just yesterday we received positive feedback from 2 of them. So maybe as soon as possible will be published, but only for you if you want to read it. And that's all for now. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will be very happy to answer to any questions or comments that maybe you have.
Many thanks, Aimée, for this very interesting presentation. Any comments or questions from the participants?
I don't know if in the chat there's some question.
I can start if you want.
Yes.
Well, yeah, so I have a couple of questions. The first one is if you can account for any type of fixed effects in case it's possible in your methods. And the second one is if you also started to analyze which factors can explain the different levels of convergence that you are seeing in the data.
Can you repeat the last one, please?
Yeah, the second question is whether you have started to estimate which factors can also explain the different levels of convergence that you are identifying in the data. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Regarding this last one question, we haven't studied the other factors that may be contributing to these convergent processes. But we are now focused on that sectoral specialization, but for sure it will be part of future research. And about the first one, yes, a fixed effect model can be estimated with count data. So in that case, we usually move beyond standard linear fixed effect specification and use count data models as, for example, fixed effect estimators. But in our case, however, the dependent variable is GDP per capita growth. So this is a continuous variable rather than a count variable. So maybe fixed effect framework was appropriated for the objectives of our analysis. And for sure, our future direction is to extend this analysis for other panel specification. Also, another line for future research is to account for dynamic expressions, no only the traditional cross-sectional specification of beta convergence. So we are just starting and trying to all possibilities.
Okay, thanks a lot and very interesting research.
Another question?
Yeah, can I ask a couple of questions? First of all, I would like to ask you better which kind of variable did you analyze? So it's the ratio between receipt and the GDP. Is it correct?
GDP per capita in PPS, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
It's like a dependent variable. I have also to say that in the research paper you can see that we also analyze for productive labor productive labor productivity variable.
Okay.
Yes,
So,
but it's summarized here only GDP first.
in fact, the first question was just related to the variable you analyzed, because, as you know, it can depend on the variable. If you consider receipt in general is just related to international tourists, not the domestic one. So probably you could consider also this aspect and take into consideration, for example, also overnight stays rather than arrivals. This is the first question, but you already answered. Reply to this answer to this question, and the
Yes,
second one, the
sorry
second one is just related. Is related to the methodology. I'm wondering whether you try to test the merging class. I know that there are some tests to assess whether the clubs can be merged together, and if you consider also the magnitude of the coefficient, because this information provides you information about relative or absolute convergence, right? If it's more than 2 is absolute, if it's between 0 and 2 is relative convergence. So this is my questions. Thank you.
You're welcome. I can hear you really well because I'm hearing, I don't know about you, but I'm hearing like noises. I don't know if you are also hearing. Yes.
There is
Okay,
someone
so
with a microphone probably open.
yeah, but more or less I understand you. I only want to also point that regarding the variable, you are completely right, and for sure the result depending on the variable used. As I told you, regarding the dependent variable, we also use labor productivity data and another type of GDP, not with PPS, and the results more or less are stable. And regarding tourism specialization, I point out that this one of the limitations, that is a proxy. This is the problem for most of tourism studies. But in the research paper, you can also see that we use another tourism variable that is air passengers related to population in that region, and the results point to the same sign. So yes, we are just starting, but thank you so much for your comments.
Any other question or remark? I check in the chat box. Okay, perhaps I have a remark for future research. I'm not sure, but perhaps it could be interesting when you emphasize in your findings the question of non-linearity about the effect of tourism on regional development. For this non-linearity, perhaps it could be interesting to mix symmetric testing, like your very advanced econometric techniques, with complexity theory and some approach derived from complexity theory, like QCA, qualitative comparative analysis, in order to mix both symmetric and asymmetric testing to deal with the complexity of this non-linearity. Perhaps it could be an option for future research on this specific point.
Thank you for your comments.
Okay. So thanks again, Aimée, for this very interesting presentation. And now we'll move to the second presentation. So it's my pleasure to introduce now Massimo Moltoni. Massimo is a third-year PhD student in social sciences at the Gran Sasso Science Institute in L'Aquila. He holds a Master of Science in Economic and Social Sciences from Bocconi University. His research focuses on tourism economics with particular attention to Airbnb and the social impacts of tourism. So the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Nicola. And thank you, Oriol and Veronica, as well for this very great opportunity to present our works. Okay. Okay. So as Nicola was saying, I'm a PhD candidate in Regional Science and Economic Geography at Gran Sasso Science Institute, where my main supervisor is Maria Giovanna Brandano. And this work is an ongoing work with the European Commission Joint Research Center, in particular with the ISPRA Territorial Development Unit, together with Riccardo Curtale, Silvia Iodice, and Felipe Battista e Silva. And this work focuses on the residents' perception of tourism impacts, that is a causal analysis on Czech municipalities. So today we are going to see, do you see me changing slide or not? Okay. So today we're going to see the presentation of the background and the empirical findings on this article, and then briefly present and discuss the further steps. So let's start with the background. So as of 2024, the total impact of tourism accounted for 10% of economic activity at worldwide level. However, we need to say that tourism generates lots of employment and business opportunities, and it stimulates local growth. However, despite this evident economic benefits, there are both environmental and socio-cultural trade-offs. In particular, there are two emblematic examples which we thought of. One example is Venice channels in times of pandemic restrictions, which is also been studied specifically, and is an example of also of how the environmental impact of tourism is visible in a well-known destination such as Venice. But also from a social perspective, we know that Barcelona, for instance, has been an emblematic case of over-tourism and of attempts to fight over-tourism from a policy perspective. And indeed, in the last decade, there has been an increase in the number of anti-tourist protests in Barcelona. So from a literature perspective, we can say that not only the ecosystems are impacted, but also the infrastructure needed to facilitate the visitor flows create a burden, an environmental burden. Instead, the social impacts encompass a lot of externalities, and among these externalities, there is also the residents' quality of life. So the motivation of this article is the following. Under the Joint Research Center Territorial Development Unit, where there is an ongoing work on this by Iodice and other authors, these colleagues found that there is a gap between scientific production and public statistics on residents' perception of tourism, meaning that there are a lot of works on residents' perception of tourism, but at the same time, the public statistics supporting this are not of the same, let's say, quality, do not expand as much as the scientific production. Also, as far as the scientific production is concerned, diverse methodologies are employed, but they mainly pertain to the social exchange theory, Whereas this study, the study you're going to see, adopts the relational framework. So the importance of the use of antecedent variable as linked to the residents' perception of tourism. So having said that, this study aims at investigating in a sentence how both individual and territorial characteristics contribute to shaping residents' perception. And in so doing, it is, to the best of our knowledge, it's the first work to embrace both the individual and the territorial dimension in a residents' perception of tourism, since the majority of studies on it focuses only on the individual dimensions. For this, we are going to see to employ the following datasets. So the first part of our dataset comes from face-to-face interviews. We are talking about 13,500 personal face-to-face interviews, which have been collected by the Czech Tourism, and which is a national statistical office set in the Czech Republic. This office has targeted people living in tourist attractive localities between 2022 and 2024. And thanks to this survey, we have lots of information, including social demographic characteristics, spatial in terms of where they did the interview and where they locate, and temporal related traits. For instance, on which day of the week they perform the interview. Social demographic characteristics instead are more of like kind of gender, education, job, whether the job is related to tourism, how long they have lived in the location, the age group, and so on. The second part, which is important for this individual level variable, is the survey questions. Namely, out of these survey questions, we have selected 2 of them. We had the list of them, and we have selected 2 has been particularly relevant for our investigation. The first is, how do you evaluate the number of tourists coming to this location? And the answers were, it could be more, it is just enough, it could be fewer. The second question was instead, what do you think about the overall impact of tourism on this location? And it offered 3 responses. Positive outweigh negatives, negatives and positive balancing each other, and the negatives outweigh positives, positive effects. The second part of our datasets is made up of territorial level variables coming from GSSI available datasets and other datasets, including, for instance, the tourism dashboard. Among these datasets, we selected a lot of variables, including cultural density, tourism intensity. For the time being, it's important just to notice that all variables were Windsorized, and second, they were Z standardized. So this is just a recap of the social demographic characteristics and the expected effect on perception of tourists according to the literature. For instance, if we take age, let's say that age, according to the literature, has a negative impact on the perception of tourists. There are positive exceptions, but in general, it's negative. And meaning that the older you get, the more likely you are going to display a negative attitude towards tourism. Or picking another one, education. Education instead has a positive effect, and without exceptions, let's say, in the sense that the higher your education level, the more likely you are to display positive attitudes towards tourism. Other variables, as said previously, include the job related to tourism, the duration at the location, meaning how long you have been living in the location, the degree of urbanization, and the gender. Let's say that among these, only job-related tourism has a clear direction. So positive in the sense that you, if you perceive, if you have job related to tourism, logically you're more likely to display positive attitudes towards tourism. The other part of the data set, as explained before, pertain to another data sets, mainly from Eurostat, but also from AirDNA, TripAdvisor, through web scraping. And they include a lot of information such as tourism density, intensity, sales price, share of Airbnbs, share of unoccupied dwellings, cultural density, and share of IATE solutions. So here you can see the definitions and the sources. Of course, in this table, there is no expected effect from the literature because this hasn't been investigated. So literature has investigated individual variables rather than territorial or destination level ones. For our research, the model we adopted in the main econometric part are basically the following. So is a multinomial logit with the perception of tourism survey. So how do you perceive tourism? Positive and negatives balance each other, positive more than negatives, negative more than positive being the answers. This is the dependent variable, and then has independent variable both the socioeconomic characteristics from the face-to-face survey and some destination-specific variables. Additionally, we perform a simple logit with a combination of two selected survey questions. So basically, we before I told you that we we select from the list of the survey questions two, and here we have a combination of these two. Namely, we created a binary variable with the value 1 if the individual was answering negative impacts and too many tourists at the same time, and 0 otherwise. The methodology instead using in the robustness checks, which you are not going to see today, it's an ongoing work, so this part is still to be performed, but we know that it's a calculation of the tourism acceptance score. Tourism acceptance score is the dependent variable in the robustness check, and the employment of econometric models are the OLS and the TOBIT with the same independent variables as the one you see previously. So the socioeconomic and the destination-specific variables. So let's now move to the empirical findings of our work. So let's say that first of all, from the top right corner, you can see that there is a very high share of respondents perceiving tourists rather positively. We are speaking about 90%. But there are, if we look at the tourism acceptance score, there are indeed some municipalities which are unwelcoming tourists. And it's clear from the bottom left corner. And if we look at the combination of the two survey questions, we see that municipalities in the border regions, you see it from the, let's say, more red color, darker red, display more negative attitudes towards tourists. And this is not only an attitude of border regions, but also, for instance, of Prague, which you see in the center of the country. So now we move to the econometric part, and we see first models with only personal characteristics. Then we are going to see a model with both personal characteristics and destination-specific characteristics. So I try to zoom a bit so you can see also the results better. So in general, what we see is that women tend to perceive more positive effects from tourism than men. This is a rather limited effect, also if compared to the other personal characteristics. So it's better now if we move directly to the other characteristics, because this is rather weak also in terms of significance. For instance, age confirms the literature findings, so it has a negative impact on the perception of tourism. Also, tourism-related income, respondents with tourism-related income have a more positive perception of tourism, and this confirms our findings. A plausible explanation for this being, for instance, the fact that that there are personal benefits from this, and so personal benefits act as drivers of this dynamic. Also, respondents with higher education are more likely to view tourists positively. This can be due to a variety of factors, but a plausible explanation, for instance, can be that of being able to understand better the socio-cultural and the economic impacts of tourism at the same time. Another interesting result is what concerns the duration of residence. Duration of residence increases the probability of perceiving positive impacts and negative impacts. So this is a very interesting result. It's a polarization, let's say, of the fact, and a plausible explanation for this can be, for instance, the fact that the longer you live in a municipality, the more likely you are economically embedded in terms of job in the tourism sector, for instance, but the more you are exposed also to the externalities of tourism. So there is this dual contribution of tourism in this case. Lastly, whether the day of the interview falls into the weekend or an holiday, it doesn't make it really any difference. If we focuses instead our attention on the model with both personal and destination characteristics, we find that first of all, the impact of personal characteristics is confirmed. So there is a very important impact of personal characteristics, also if we include territorial ones, but also territorial ones matter in explaining the residents' perception of tourism. But between the two categories, the socioeconomic characteristics carry a greater explanatory power than the destination characteristics. Going through the destination characteristics more specifically, we find, for instance, that residents living in towns and suburbs and in rural areas are more likely to perceive positively tourism than those living in cities. And this can be done, this can be due to the fact that cities tend to concentrate more the negative externalities rather than, for instance, rural places. But it can be also due to a variety of factors. Here we cannot control, for instance, for the tourist stage of development, so which is a rather important factor, but we can't control for it. So for the time being, let's say that cities perceive more negatively tourism than to towns and suburbs and rural areas. Going through instead the tourism variables, we see that respondents living in border municipalities tend to perceive tourism more negatively, as we have seen previously. Tourism intensity, surprisingly, does not make really a contribution, and whereas tourism density does make a contribution. In particular, it's there is a, let's say, a negative contribution in terms of positive impacts and very significant across both specifications. So this means that the higher the tourism density, the less likely is of a place, the less likely is an inhabitant, is the probability of an inhabitant to display positive impacts, to believe that there are positive impacts of tourism. Also, another interesting result here is that of the share of Airbnb, which we see that is also it's quite limited, but it reinforces negative attitudes towards tourism. So the next steps to briefly conclude our presentation today is just a discussion of the empirical findings in a systematic way. And of course, since the importance of the destination characteristics is at this stage recognized, also the provision of some policy recommendations can be a valuable step for us. So I thank you for the attention.
Many thanks, Massimo, for this very interesting presentation. Any question or comments? No question, I will start.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, no, I do have a question.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Massimo. First of all, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I just have a question concerning the outcome that you are analyzing. It's just because I didn't understand how is the structure of your dependent variables. So you're looking at the individual response on a survey on, let's say, their opinion about tourism. And you say you used a multi-level logic. So you have different, so they can answer on, so they have like 4 categories. I didn't understand, because then you say that you combine and you also do a logic estimation. So I'm not, I don't have clear which are the type of answer they can provide.
Yes. So there is basically both a multinomial part, a multinomial logic part, that is the blue one, let's say, and then there is the gray one, which is the logic part. So the multinomial, in the multinomial, basically respondents could answer positive. We believe that there are positive impacts from tourism, and that's 1, let's say, value 1 in the first column. In the second column, if they believe that there are negative impacts, then the value is 1 for the second column. 0 otherwise. So 0 is the, let's say, the it's the base of this. And for instance, for the logic, instead, there is a combination of not only of the negative impacts variable, but is combined with the too many tourists variable. So basically, it has value 1 if they answer that there is at the same time both too many tourists and negative impacts outweighing positive, and 0 otherwise. Of course, this one is much more concentrated in responses, because as you've seen previously, there are not so many negative responses in Czechia about tourism. So about 7%, for instance, is negative. So it's rather concentrated with respect to the other one.
I see. Thank you very much. Now it's clear.
Okay, we have a question in the chat box from Yuetan asking if you could tell more about the GRT data collection and how to use this kind of second data to analyze the variable.
Okay, so for instance, here you see that from this part, you see that let's take, for instance, tourism density and tourism intensity are data from Eurostat both and for Eurogeographics, but at low level, you can find tourism density in the tourism dashboard, which is a publicly available tool. You can search for it, and even at the municipal level, so it's pretty useful. Tourism intensity is available at low level, at municipal level, only from Eurostat. Then sales price, it's an ESPON data from a project which is called House for All. So it's a different data source from the other two. Share of unoccupied dwellings is from Census Hub. So here you can see some references about this. Eurostat for share of unoccupied dwellings and Silker and other authors for sales price. Share of Airbnbs is data from RDNA and Eurostat. Yeah, both of them. And also for share of iNature solutions, you see some web scraping from RDNA and TripAdvisor. So yeah, there is this kind of approach in this kind of data. And yeah, that's it. For cultural density is web scraping of cultural gems, which is a program identifying European program identifying cultural assets, and TripAdvisor. So again, you see the combination of let's say a more recent data source and a more established data source that is cultural gems, a more European one.
Okay, a link has been added in the chat for the tourism dashboard. We have another question from Giovanna Camacho Duarte in the chat, who is doing a similar research on this topic. What do you believe in the role of the layout culture of territory, and which other variables do you consider important to evaluate when understanding the negative and positive impacts of tourism in a destination? And what are the places to do case studies that you will be using to evaluate?
Okay, this is a very nice question. So I would say, in addition to these ones, to the data sets we employ, I would say one key variable would be the nature of tourists. So whether they are daily travelers, how long they are staying in the, how much they spend in the municipality, how long they are staying in the municipality. This can be very useful because I think it really makes a difference in terms of how the locals benefit or not from tourism if a tourist is going to stay one night in a municipality or just 4 or 3 nights. And this can be also, let's say, envisaged from